Greetings, class. It's a joy to come to you in this format for the first time, and don't want to skip a beat in our class, so sorry I couldn't make it to our Google Meet this week. But let's dive right into our material so you're prepared for your test this week as well. In our last Google Meet session, we did examine the manuscript reliability of the New Testament, and ultimately came to the conclusion that if someone is to deny the manuscript reliability of the New Testament, you would have to deny all ancient manuscripts in history, in early history, and that would be absurd. So the New Testament, in terms of its manuscript reliability, is far greater than anything else written during that time period. So today, in this lecture and material, we're going to look at the historical reliability of the New Testament. And historians over the years have come up with a set of criteria to examine anything in terms of its historical reliability. And the New Testament, we're going to put that to the test. So, there are 7 criteria for historical reliability to examine for the New Testament. The first one is, do we have early testimony? Obviously, the earlier the testimony, the better. The closer the sources are to the event itself, it's more likely to be accurate and reliable. Example I gave you last time was, could you remember what you ate for dinner last night? Yeah, you probably could. But can you remember what you ate for dinner 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, a year ago? Probably not. So the farther back we go in time, the more vague the details can get from somebody trying to give an account. Don't often remember as accurately the more time goes on. Second criteria is, do we have eyewitness testimony? Obviously, an eyewitness is the best and most credible source for establishing what happened, somebody who was actually there and saw the event. The third criteria is, do we have testimony from multiple independent eyewitness sources? Was there more than one person that can testify to it? And not just more than one person, but are they giving testimony all independently, separate from each other in terms of influence on each other over what to say? An example that I have of non-independent eyewitness testimony is one time I got in a car accident. I was driving through a neighborhood, and a car was parked alongside on the curb, and all of a sudden it just took off. No signal, no indicators, right in front of me. I tried to slam on my brakes and swerve, and I almost missed him, but I clipped him on the back because that's all I could do. It was totally outside of my control. And so both of us stopped. Driver got out of his car, I got out of my car. And the first thing he said was, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't see you, I'm so sorry. Please, whatever you do, don't call the police." And so I suspected something right off the bat, because he actually did look a little bit under the influence. And but it was too late. We already heard a police siren in the distance. Somebody in the neighborhood must have seen something and called them. And so as the police officer arrived, he separated myself and the driver to opposite sides of the street, and he took my testimony first, and I told him what happened from my perspective. And while I was talking to the officer, a bunch of young people came out of the house right there on the corner. Looked like they were very much friends with the driver, and I saw them talking together in kind of a huddle. And that kind of raised some red flags for me. And so the officer finished taking my testimony, walked across the street to interview the driver. And also, I could see other people of his friends pitching in. And so I thought to myself, this probably is not going to go well for me. Sure enough, when the officer finished taking their testimony, he walked across the street and promptly issued me a ticket for being responsible for the accident. What had really happened, though, was that the testimony that he got from the other people, maybe they were eyewitnesses, maybe not. but they certainly weren't independent because the young man, the driver, told them what to say. And that convinced the police officer when it shouldn't have. And so I decided to fight the ticket. And so before I left the scene of the accident, I took pictures. I had skid marks. I actually measured them. I did some physics calculations about the speed that I was traveling and the distance that it took me to stop and swerve because the other driver had said that I was speeding and the cop wrote me down for speeding. And I took pictures of my car and the other driver's car to be able to show where we hit each other. And when I put that all together in a document to provide evidence for what really happened, the judge threw my ticket out. And so I was able to prove my case, but the police officer certainly didn't go by this third criteria of multiple independent eyewitness sources. That's important for historical reliability when it comes to any kind of ancient manuscript or any event at all. Number 4 for criteria is, are the eyewitnesses trustworthy? That could go back to my last example too. The friends of the driver were not trustworthy because they were backing him up no matter what and trying to get me in trouble instead. But here's a case then where character matters. It counts. Who's giving the testimony? Do they have something at stake in what they're testifying to? The 5th, do we have corroborating evidence from archaeology or other writers? Other writers we've already seen for the New Testament with the non-Christian sources and with the Ante-Nicene church fathers, the disciples of the apostles. But when it comes to archaeology, that's a wealth of resources to confirm ancient writings. If a writing mentions a place and you actually find that place archaeologically, it backs up the manuscript. Back in the 60s, there was a lot of criticism about the New Testament talking about Pontius Pilate, and some people were trying to make the claim that Pontius Pilate was not a historical figure because there was no archaeological evidence that Pontius Pilate actually lived and was a governing ruler in Judea. And then not too long after that criticism, they actually did find in an archaeological dig a column that had an order from Pontius Pilate with his name below it, which proved his existence and his historicity and shut those critics up because archaeology confirmed and backed up Pontius Pilate being a real person. 6th criteria is, do we have enemy attestations? We've already covered that to a large extent. If somebody does not like you or is not favorable to you, yet they still testify in your favor, that is very credible. An example, if a gentleman is on trial for murder and the mom testifies against him, that says a lot, because otherwise the mother's instinct would be to do anything she could to protect her son. 7th criteria is, does the testimony contain events or details that are embarrassing to the author? Anybody, when we share a story or write something about ourselves, generally like to present ourselves in the best light possible, make us look good. I would be no exception, yet I'm about to tell you an embarrassing story about myself. And that story is this. Back when I was a senior in high school, we had an awards ceremony preceding graduation the night before. It was in our school theater and auditorium. And the last award of the night was the highest award that could be given to a member of the senior class, and it was concerning the person who demonstrated the highest degree of achievement in both academics and athletics, and taking those two in mind together. And when they announced the winner for the first time, there were 2 winners, my twin brother and myself. Just strictly based on alphabetical order. And my twin brother's name was Scott, so he was called up to the stage first. And now, mind you, during this ceremony, we are in cap and gown. It's a formal ceremony. And we gentlemen are not used to walking in dresses because the gowns go down that length. And so when my twin brother Scott went to step up to the stage, his gown got caught on one of his toes of his shoe, and he hit the base or the side of the step with a loud bang. And he stumbled a little bit up onto the stage, got his award, and then successfully went down the steps to take a seat. Then it was my turn, and they called my name, and there's only one thought going through my mind. It wasn't receiving the award. It was, Steve, whatever you do, don't stumble on that step up to the stage like your twin brother did. We were already lumped together with so many things throughout the time of our life that's one thing I didn't want to have in common with him. And so in my dare to be different mentality, I was thinking of failure. And whatever you do, don't trip on that step. Don't trip on that step. Don't let that gown hit your foot and tangle up with it and trip on that step. And guess what I did? My gown got tangled up in my shoe, and I hit that side of the step and the whole audience just started roaring. Oh, it's like twins. They have to do things the same way. And I didn't even think about the award when I got up on that stage. I was like, man, I just couldn't wait to get back to my seat and hide. It's very embarrassing. But as I tell you that story, it's far more likely that it's true because I'm not presenting myself in the light of the best I could possibly have done. I just marched up the steps to that stage and took my diploma and was different than my twin brother and received all the accolades with pride and joy. Nope. So anything that's embarrassing tends to probably be more reliable. So let's examine with a little bit more detail how the New Testament fares under those 7 criteria. Back to number 1, do we have early testimony? All the New Testament books were likely written, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit, before AD 70. And the reason why I say that is because in AD 70, a very significant event happened in the life of Israel, and that was Jerusalem was destroyed and the temple was destroyed by the Roman army. No New Testament book, manuscript, mentions that event. If any of them were written after that event, surely they would have said something about it. It would have fulfilled the prophecy of Jesus saying no stone was going to be left unturned concerning the temple. And also, the temple being destroyed, there's no more sacrifices to be made because they can't. The temple doesn't exist anymore. And so that's so historically significant, it would be weird, unusual, unbelievable that a New Testament manuscript wouldn't mention it. But it doesn't. So they must have been written before that event took place. In fact, we can probably narrow down the writing of some of the New Testament, especially Paul, back into the late 40s, early 50s. And what's important about the New Testament manuscripts being written within that time frame is that writings that were written while the people in those events were alive are there to challenge the account if they hear about it and say, no, that's not what happened. Or they could say, yeah, that goes along with what I saw. And so a myth, something untrue, a legend, a story, is hard to develop when the eyewitnesses present for that event are still alive. We also then have all kinds of New Testament documents cited by the early church fathers. We went through some of those examples in our last time together, but we have a long list of Clement, Ignatius, and Polycarp, and all the different books of the New Testament that they cite. It's overwhelming. Criteria number 2, how does the New Testament stack up to eyewitness testimony? In your notes, you have a plethora of New Testament quotations, all of them documenting, citing that all these events took place in front of eyewitnesses. Third criteria, do we have evidence from multiple independent eyewitnesses? Certainly we do. There are the 12 apostles, James, Paul, at one time 500 others witnessed an event. We have women who, interestingly enough, under Jewish tradition, the testimony of a woman in court was not allowed. They weren't viewed as credible witnesses, and so why would the New Testament include them? Makes it more historically reliable. Mary Magdalene, Mary, Joanna, Salome, in fact, that's what I love. It was women who were the first witnesses to the resurrection. God was making a powerful point in that. There are also 4 different Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And the Gospel of Mark is associated with Peter as well. And then we have different writers in the New Testament: Paul, James, Peter, John. And the fact that we have 4 Gospels also speaks to multiple independent witnesses, because they don't all say the same thing. They don't all cover the same story. They include different details when they cover the same story or event. That's powerful, because what would you think if all 4 Gospels were exactly the same? If they had the same chapters, the same verses, the same sentences, the same words? You would think something was funny about that. You would think there was collusion. All 4 of them got together and said, hey, if we're going to be believed, we all need to write and say the same thing. But they don't. And the fact that there are differing details, that it's not uniform accounts, that they do diverge from each other on how they present different stories, lends credibility to the gospel accounts, because you have multiple independent eyewitnesses. Criteria number 4, are the eyewitnesses trustworthy? If you consider the authors of the New Testament manuscripts, many of them sacrificed their careers, their lives, their reputations for the sake of the gospel. You have in your notes a whole recording, a whole set of examples of how the apostles, at least by tradition or at least likely by history, met their deaths, and most of them were martyred. Paul himself was beheaded in Rome. And in 2 Corinthians 11, verses 23 through 28, he gives a long list of sufferings that he endured for the gospel. Their character, the character of the apostles, was above reproach. It was a hardship, a trial for them to do what they did. Highly unlikely that someone would go through that for something that they knew was a lie. Number 5, do we have corroborating evidence from archaeology or other writers? In your handout, you have page after page after page after page after page of examples of archaeological evidence, and that's not exhaustive for how archaeology has confirmed what's written in the New Testament manuscripts. Number 6, do we have enemy attestations? We've already covered that. Number 7, does the testimony contain events or details that are embarrassing to the authors? Absolutely. Numerous times the disciples are recorded as not understanding what Jesus said. They were portrayed as uncaring. They fell asleep in the garden when Jesus said it was the most important time in his life, and stay awake with me and pray. Jesus rebukes the disciples. He corrects them. He admonishes them. They're portrayed as cowards after Jesus was crucified. They went and hid. They are also, like Thomas, full of doubt, weren't sure about what was going on. And consider what writers in the New Testament even included in stories about Jesus and what other people said about Jesus. Some of his own family members said he was crazy, nuts, out of his mind. That some of his own family didn't even believe him and his claims. Many of his followers deserted him at various times during his teaching and his ministry. He was called a drunkard. He was called demon-possessed. He was called a madman. He was called a sinner because of his approximate acquaintanceship and relationship with women of ill repute. And so he was guilty by association. These things, if you want to present a Messiah, you probably wouldn't include these kinds of things in your testimony, in this case about Jesus. So it brings more credibility to the gospel accounts historically. And then finally, as we kind of covered with the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, the New Testament calls for some pretty dramatic changes in going from the Old Testament to the New Covenant, from the Old Covenant to the New Covenant, which is, you have a short list on your last page in the handout, that in the Old Testament you were going from animal sacrifices to no longer the need for animal sacrifices, because Christ himself was the ultimate sacrifice, paying the price for our sins by his blood. That's a huge change, because you're saying the temple is not needed anymore. Why would you make such a claim that so many people would discount automatically if there wasn't some truth behind it? You're also going from the law of Moses, the greatest, most respected teacher in Israel, to the teachings of Jesus, and saying that he's fulfilled the teachings of Moses, superseded them, built upon them with better promises. Why would you say that if there wasn't some veracity to that? You're replacing the Sabbath with Sunday worship, and you're replacing circumcision, which is how you are identified as being Jewish for a man as an Israelite, and replacing it with baptism and communion as the ordinances that you physically, outwardly observe to be a part of the body of Christ, the church. And so all these things combined together demonstrate that the New Testament is certainly historically reliable. It passes all 7 criteria that historians have established, and it does so convincingly and fully. So we've demonstrated that case, and that puts us in a position where we're ready to move on into our next unit. But first, you have a test. So, I wish you well on that. Please feel free to message me any questions that you have over this material before you complete that test. And I look forward to seeing you guys again soon. Bye. Love you.